CEO was forced to marry a worthless, single dad. Then the chairman revealed his true identity. The CEO signed the marriage certificate with trembling hands, convinced she had just been forced to marry the most worthless man she had ever met. Across the table stood Daniel Carter, a quiet single father in a faded suit, holding the hand of his 8-year-old daughter. To everyone in that luxurious boardroom, he looked like a broken man who had nothing to offer. But before the ink on the marriage certificate had even dried, the company chairman looked at the CEO and asked one question that made the entire room fall silent. "Do you really know who you just married?" For 29-year-old Victoria Bennett, losing control was something she had never experienced. She was the youngest CEO in Bennett Global, a corporation worth billions, and she had spent years proving that she belonged in a world where powerful men constantly waited for her to fail. She had built her reputation on discipline, intelligence, and an almost frightening ability to keep her emotions hidden. But that strength had never prepared her for the day her grandfather, Chairman Richard Bennett, summoned her to his private office and told her that she had 48 hours to marry Daniel Carter, a struggling single father she had never met before. Victoria thought it was a joke. Then she saw the documents. Her grandfather had placed an agreement on the desk explaining that a major voting trust controlling nearly 38% of Bennett Global would transfer to Victoria only if she entered a legal marriage approved by the family trust before her 30th birthday. It was an old condition created decades earlier by her grandmother, designed to prevent the company from falling into the hands of someone who valued money more than people. Victoria hated the condition, but what made her angrier was the name written on the marriage agreement. Daniel Carter. A man with no executive position, no wealthy family, and no impressive resume. He worked temporary maintenance jobs, lived in a small rented apartment, and was raising his daughter alone after losing his wife several years earlier. The family documents described him as financially unstable. To Victoria, that sounded like another word for failure. She had seen men chase her money before. She assumed Daniel was no different. The first time she saw him, her judgment seemed confirmed. He arrived at the Bennett estate wearing a modest dark suit that had clearly been carefully cleaned and pressed but was several years out of fashion. His shoes were worn. His hair was slightly untidy. Beside him stood his little daughter, Emma, clutching a small pink backpack. Daniel looked nervous, but he never looked greedy. He never stared at the expensive paintings, the marble floors, or the enormous chandelier above them. His attention remained on Emma, making sure she was comfortable. Victoria barely noticed that detail. She only saw what she believed was beneath her. The marriage ceremony was painfully simple. There were no flowers, no celebration, and no happiness. Victoria wore an elegant white dress because her grandfather insisted, while Daniel wore the same dark suit he had arrived in. When the photographer asked them to stand closer, Victoria moved only because she had to. Daniel noticed her discomfort and quietly kept his distance. That should have made her feel better. Instead, it irritated her. After the ceremony, Victoria told Daniel that their marriage would exist only on paper. He would have a place to live, financial support, and whatever was necessary for Emma, but he would never interfere with her career or expect affection from her. Daniel simply accepted the conditions without arguing. His only request was that Emma never be made to feel unwanted. Victoria almost laughed at that. She couldn't understand why a man who had apparently been handed a life-changing opportunity would ask for so little. She didn't know that Daniel had already turned down opportunities worth millions. She didn't know that he had spent years hiding from the very world Victoria desperately wanted to control. And she certainly didn't know why Chairman Richard Bennett had personally chosen him. For the first few weeks, the marriage was cold. Victoria worked from early morning until midnight and treated the house like a hotel. Daniel never complained. He prepared Emma's meals, helped her with homework, repaired small things around the house, and quietly cleaned up after everyone. He never demanded Victoria's attention. But slowly, tiny things began to disturb Victoria's carefully constructed opinion of him. One evening, she returned home after a brutal board meeting and found Emma sitting at the kitchen table crying over a broken school project. Daniel was sitting beside her, carefully rebuilding a miniature wooden bridge from pieces of cardboard and thin sticks. He had apparently spent nearly 2 hours trying to fix it because Emma had a school presentation the next morning. Victoria watched from the doorway. She noticed his hands. They were rough, marked with tiny scars and calluses. They were not the hands of a rich businessman. They were the hands of someone who had worked for everything he had. Emma eventually smiled. Daniel smiled back. There was no frustration, no impatience, no complaint about wasting his evening. Victoria walked away before either of them noticed her watching. The next morning, she found the repaired project sitting near the front door. It was not perfect. One side was slightly crooked. But it stood. For reasons she couldn't explain, she thought about it throughout the day. Then came the first real crisis. Bennett Global suddenly began losing millions through a series of suspicious transactions. A group of investors started selling their shares, and rumors spread that someone inside the company was secretly working with a competitor. Victoria spent 3 sleepless nights trying to identify the leak. Every executive around her blamed someone else. Daniel remained silent. Until one night, Victoria returned home exhausted and found him looking at a printed financial report she had accidentally left on the dining table. She became furious. But Daniel didn't defend himself or make excuses. He simply pointed out a pattern in the transaction dates. Several transfers had been approved during hours when the company's internal security system showed Victoria attending meetings elsewhere. She stared at the report. The pattern was real. For the first time, Victoria realized that the man she had considered useless had noticed something that her entire financial department had missed. She asked how he knew what to look for. Daniel only explained that he had spent years studying financial systems and risk management. Victoria was stunned. She assumed he was exaggerating. The following morning, she asked her chief financial officer to investigate the pattern. Within hours, they discovered that the transactions were connected to a senior executive who had been secretly transferring company funds to a competitor. Daniel had been right. Victoria fired the executive and prevented what could have become a devastating financial scandal. But instead of thanking Daniel, she felt confused. Who exactly was this man? The answer became even more mysterious when Victoria discovered that Daniel had once worked at a prestigious investment firm under a different name. His employment record had suddenly disappeared from public databases several years earlier. When she confronted her grandfather about it, he refused to explain. He only told her that Daniel Carter was not the man she thought he was. That sentence stayed with her. Meanwhile, Emma slowly became attached to Victoria. At first, the little girl was afraid of her stepmother. Victoria was always serious, always busy, always dressed as if she were walking into a board meeting. But Emma kept finding small ways to bring warmth into her life. She left drawings on Victoria's desk. She placed a cup of hot chocolate beside her laptop during late-night work. She once fell asleep waiting for Victoria to return from the office because she wanted to show her a school award. Victoria discovered the sleeping child on the couch that night. Something inside her softened. She covered Emma with a blanket and sat beside her for several minutes. For the first time, the enormous house did not feel like a place she owned. It felt like a home. If you believe that kindness can change people, that everyone deserves a second chance, and that a person's worth should never be judged by their appearance or bank account, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to SoulTales for more emotional stories about kindness, family, and second chances. Weeks passed, and Victoria's feelings toward Daniel began changing in ways she didn't want to admit. She started noticing how he always gave Emma the best piece of food. How he repaired things instead of replacing them. How he remembered the names of household workers and asked about their families. How he never used Victoria's money to impress anyone. And one rainy evening, when Victoria's car broke down outside the office, Daniel drove through heavy traffic to pick her up without asking why she had called him. He arrived soaked from the rain. He gave her his jacket. He never complained. Victoria sat silently in the passenger seat, watching the rain slide down the window. For the first time, she realized that the man she had called worthless had never once treated anyone as worthless. The turning point came during Bennett Global's annual shareholder meeting. Victoria entered the packed auditorium expecting another difficult battle. Several investors had become openly hostile after the financial scandal, and a rival group was preparing to challenge her leadership. Daniel sat quietly near the back of the room with Emma. Victoria assumed he was there only because she had asked him to come. Then Chairman Richard Bennett walked onto the stage. The room became silent. He held a thick black folder in his hands. Instead of beginning the shareholder meeting, he looked directly at Victoria and then at Daniel. He announced that the marriage condition had never been about forcing Victoria to marry a poor man. It had been a test. The family trust required Victoria to demonstrate that she could recognize character beyond wealth, appearance, status, and power. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Daniel Carter was not a struggling nobody. Years earlier, he had founded one of the country's most successful financial technology companies under a private identity. Before selling his company, he had built a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had walked away from the spotlight after his wife died, choosing to raise Emma privately rather than expose her to the world of wealth and media attention. But there was more. Daniel had secretly become one of Bennett Global's largest individual investors years earlier. He had never revealed his identity because he wanted to know whether Victoria would respect him without knowing what he owned. The room erupted in whispers. Victoria couldn't move. Every assumption she had made about him came crashing down at once. The chairman revealed that Daniel had been the anonymous investor who had repeatedly protected Bennett Global from hostile takeovers. He had also been the person who alerted the family trust to financial irregularities inside the company. Victoria remembered the broken school project, the late-night repairs, the financial report, the rain-soaked drive. All the moments she had mistaken for weakness had actually revealed something far more valuable than money. Character. The chairman then explained the final condition of the trust. Victoria would receive full control of Bennett Global, but only if she willingly chose to remain married to Daniel after learning the truth. For the first time, Victoria understood the cruelty of her earlier judgment. She had thought Daniel needed her. In reality, he had never needed her money, her company, or her status. He had simply wanted someone who would see him as a person. Victoria walked toward him with tears filling her eyes. Daniel didn't look proud. He didn't look angry. He simply looked at her with the same quiet expression he had carried since the day they met. Victoria finally understood that the richest person in that room wasn't necessarily the one with the largest fortune. It was the person who could have used his power to humiliate everyone who had underestimated him, but chose kindness instead. The marriage that began as an arrangement slowly became something neither of them had expected. Victoria stopped seeing Daniel as the worthless single father her family had forced into her life. She saw a devoted father. A loyal man. A person who had endured loss without allowing grief to turn him bitter. And Daniel saw something changing inside Victoria too. The ambitious CEO who once measured people by success began spending weekends with Emma. She started visiting employees' families. She began listening before making decisions. She learned that leadership was not about standing above everyone else. It was about standing beside them. Months later, Bennett Global was stronger than ever. But Victoria's greatest transformation had nothing to do with the company's profits. One evening, she returned home to find Daniel and Emma in the backyard, trying to build another little wooden bridge for Emma's science project. Victoria smiled. This time, she sat beside them. There were no cameras. No shareholders. No billion-dollar deals. Just 3 people building something together. And Victoria finally understood the lesson her grandfather had tried to teach her. Sometimes the person we dismiss as worthless is carrying a value we are simply too blind to see. Sometimes the quietest person in the room has survived battles we know nothing about. And sometimes life places someone in our path not to take something from us, but to teach us what we were missing. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes people deserve second chances, and subscribe to SoulTales. Your support helps these stories reach someone who may need a little hope today. Before we end, I want you to leave one special comment: kindness sees what pride cannot. Because Daniel's greatest secret was never his fortune, his company, or his hidden identity. His greatest secret was that despite everything he had lost, he had never stopped being kind. And perhaps that is the real measure of a person's worth, not what they own, not what they wear, and not how powerful they appear, but how they treat the people who have nothing to give them in return. Victoria once believed she had been forced to marry a worthless man. In the end, she discovered that she had been given a second chance to learn what true worth really meant.